perspective about a country called Yugoslavia and what's going on in Yugoslavia right now. Actually, I have 13 points to make, and I'll do them numerically. The first one is that the Constitution of the United States grants Congress sole authority to declare war. All members of Congress, the President, and various other officials are sworn to abide by all of its provisions. Mr. Clinton has taken it upon himself, however, to initiate war against Yugoslavia, and Congress has disgracefully allowed him to proceed without the required declaration of war. If this very clear and unambiguous clause in the Constitution can be ignored, can't other portions of the document be similarly ignored? Have we arrived at the rule of man and discarded the rule of law? That's really a question that has to come out of this. Point number two, the U.S. government has been authorized to create a military arm for nothing other than protection of the lives, liberty, and property of the American people who pay for that military. U.S. armed forces are not the President's private army, do not exist to police the world, should not perform as a global cop for NATO or the United Nations, and are not authorized to function as a humanitarian agency for anyone in need. The American people pay dearly to maintain those armed forces. One entirely proper use of the military in recent years saw the U.S. Marine Corps evacuate Americans who were caught up in a civil war in the African nation of Liberia. Once the Marines rescued those Americans in Liberia, they exited Liberia and returned to their bases. And the turmoil in that nation, however ugly it was left to the competing forces to settle amongst themselves. Why not in Yugoslavia? Point number three. U.S. forces in this current war against Yugoslavia serve under NATO command. Created in 1949 solely as a defensive alliance, NATO's brief 14-article treaty references the United Nations in 5 separate instances. Here is the NATO treaty. And you can see it's not a very large document. That's it, the entire NATO treaty. Mentions the United Nations in 5 separate places. It says Security Council in 3 other places. The treaty states that all parties to the treaty undertake, and this is a quote, undertake as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations to settle any international disputes in which they may be involved. In other words, NATO cannot function except under the United Nations. It also states that any response to an armed attack taken by the alliance is a right, quote, recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, which shall immediately be reported to the Security Council. And there are people who say, no, NATO has nothing to do with the United Nations. Incredible. NATO is and always has been a stepchild of the UN. Its treaty further states that no action it takes can be, quote, in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So they've said it 3 or 4 different times. While NATO troops do not wear blue helmets and have blue arm patches affixed to their uniforms, they serve ultimately under UN jurisdiction. Now, 50 years ago, this week is when NATO began, 1949. To sell NATO to the U.S. Congress, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, in the Truman administration, one of the leading lights of the Council on Foreign Relations, wholeheartedly supported NATO, and he explained on March 19, 1949, and this is a quote, "It is designed to fit precisely into the framework of the United Nations, and it is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations." That's how NATO was sold to the U.S. Congress. Point number 4, the NATO treaty authorizes its participant nations to engage only in defensive military action, which is to be undertaken only if one or more of the parties to the treaty experience an armed attack. Yugoslavia is not a member of NATO, and no NATO nation has been attacked by Yugoslavia. The NATO-UN action clearly violates the NATO treaty on several counts. 5th point, NATO was originally presented to the Congress and the American people as a buffer to thwart any possible advance to the West by the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union no longer exists. Why, therefore, does NATO still exist? The hidden answer is that as a regional grouping of nations, NATO will facilitate full transition to the planned UN-controlled world government. NATO has already created its own political and economic mission, a development far in excess of what our nation agreed to in 1949. Even as bad as it was agreeing to it in 1949, it had no political arm, it had no economic mission. It does now. Point number 6, Kosovo is a province of the nation of Yugoslavia. It's as much a part of Yugoslavia as Missouri is a part of the United States. The conflict centered there, therefore, is a civil war within Yugoslavia's borders. The UN Charter, under which NATO was allowed to come into existence, says, Article 2, Paragraph 7, UN Charter now, nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. If that hadn't been there, most of the nations would never have joined the UN. They didn't want the UN meddling within their borders. The UN and its NATO stepchild are clearly in violation of the UN Charter. Those who lead these two bodies and national leaders who participate in the ongoing war against Yugoslavia have demonstrated they have little or no regard for law and should not be trusted with power. Point 7. NATO is led by a Spanish socialist, Javier Solana, whose personal history includes his own vigorous protests against war. Its military arm is led by U.S. Army General Wesley Clark. Wesley Clark is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Wesley Clark is a Rhodes Scholar who was in Oxford University during the same time Bill Clinton was there, and they knew each other as students way back then. When reports about NATO's actions are given by America's mass media, some of the key individuals supplying the information are British or Spanish, but the military action they described is being carried out almost entirely by Americans. Point number 8. The United States has no business meddling in a civil war in a country that has likely had more civil wars in the past 600 years than the rest of the world combined. The final decision to have our forces intervene in this part of the world was made by non-U.S. personnel who sit at the top of NATO and the UN. To imagine that Bill Clinton is heartsick over the plight of some refugees from a civil war in Kosovo is completely ludicrous. Bill Clinton is heart-rendered. Oh, it's terrible. Beyond that, is it wise for America to allow a draft dodger to have any voice in conducting a war? Point number 9. Americans have lately been inundated with heart-rending photos and reports detailing the plight of the helpless victims of Yugoslavia's internal struggle, most of whose victims did not become victims until after we started the bombing. These reports have induced many U.S. citizens to conclude that someone has to do something, and that someone most frequently suggested is Uncle Sam. Now, I've had this happen to me on radio shows. Somebody's got to do something, and I say to them, okay, fine. Your son is first, or your daughter, and certainly your wallet. And all of a sudden, the ardor for someone to do something fades away. Beyond the personnel that Mr. Clinton is willing to commit to a struggle that poses no threat whatsoever to our nation, every American should realize that American tax dollars are being expended to fuel a war that is completely without constitutional authorization. Another point. When Yugoslavia broke up a few years ago, Croatia broke out of it, was one of its provinces, and became an independent nation, as did Slovenia, farther to the north. When Croatia broke away, the Croats forcibly expelled somewhere between 300 and 500,000 Serbs who were living in that part of Croatia. These people had lived there for many hundreds of years, their families. They had put down roots and so forth. And what was done to them is exactly what Milosevic is doing to the Albanians in Kosovo. But nobody said anything at the time about that. We didn't send any bombers. We didn't send any missions. NATO didn't get involved and so forth. And so you say to yourself, why not? If not then, why now? And the answer is they weren't ready then. They're ready now. Another point. Multiple gains. Those of you who are students of Robert Welsh, and I would guess that's close to everybody in the room, would remember that Mr. Welsh always told us that the conspiracy never does anything with just one simple goal. There are multiple gains that they look for out of their actions. What are multiple gains that could come for the conspiracy out of this action? Well, the first thing is to strengthen NATO and the United Nations. Second multiple gain would be to take this guy Milosevic, whom of course I have very little regard for, he's a lifelong communist, and to make him the first victim of the new International Criminal Court that they want so much. And if they've demonized Milosevic to the point that they have demonized him, then a lot of people will say, yes, this International Criminal Court is a very good thing, we've got to have it, and so on. Another of the multiple gains. The third possible multiple gain, and this is something that really frightens, and that is a pan-Slavic alliance involving the nations in that part of Europe that have Slavic ethnic backgrounds, and that would include Russia. A pan-Slavic alliance to oppose the NATO forces and to have this thing really grow to the kind of thing that happened out of World War I, where it started in the Balkans and pretty soon it became a world war. That is not an impossibility at all. I've seen some indications in the papers just this week where they're talking about that. We have to recall that most Americans have been persuaded that communism's dead and we don't have anything to worry about anymore. But if you ask them and say, well, you know that the communists in Russia, in the Soviet Union, had a tremendous stockpile of atomic weapons. What do you suppose happened to those atomic weapons? Aren't they still there? Doesn't Boris Yeltsin still have the button? Doesn't he still have the capability of pushing it? And the answer is yes. Could this thing develop into a full-scale world war with obvious advantages to the conspiracy against civilization? Yes, it could. It is very, very dangerous. Everything about it. I didn't think that initially, but I've begun to think it. Happily, we have a voicemail system, and some of us talk back and forth to each other without ever talking to each other on the voicemail. We've been throwing opinions back and forth about what we see happening and so forth. One of our best sources on this subject, the guy who simply amazes me, is Will Grigg. He's pointed this out. I pointed out the ICC part of it. Somebody else pointed out something else about it. And they were all correct, unfortunately. Multiple gains. Okay, so there's all the bad side of it. What's the good side of it? Well, the good side of it is that Ron Paul's H.R. 1146 has been reintroduced in the Congress of the United States to have the U.S. withdraw completely from the United Nations, and positive action on that measure will put an end to sovereignty-compromising adventurism and stop the ongoing drive. I have here Ron Paul's Dear Colleague letter that he sent to all 435 of his colleagues in the Congress, and it starts off, "The free men of America did not wait until usurped power had strengthened itself. They detected the abuses in principle, and they prevented the abuses by denying the principle." James Madison. He goes on to talk about Ohio Senator Robert Taft, voted for UN, later concluded the UN has become a trap, let's go it alone. He quotes Secretary General Boutros Ghali, who said, "The time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty, however, has passed." Boutros actually said that. So he goes on and he talks about the Madison Principle. "We dare not wait until the United Nations has control of our country and try to wrest ourselves from under that control." He said we've got to deny the principle before it swallows us and takes control of us. There are now 14 co-sponsors to that bill. They're busily working on getting more. Your congressman has to hear from you. H.R. 1146. It is about as important a piece of legislation as could be imagined. Well, there's some perspective on Yugoslavia. It's not a pretty picture. One other point, and that's this. 3 Americans were captured. We've all seen their pictures. They got beat up. Obviously, they had black eyes and bruises and everything else. Those 3 men were serving in Macedonia. A few years ago, a young fellow from Texas named Michael New refused to put on a blue patch on his uniform and be transferred to a United Nations operation in Macedonia, exactly where these fellas were, except that less than a year ago it was changed from a UN operation to a NATO operation, and those who are serving there in Macedonia now don't wear the UN patches, don't have the UN berets and helmets and so forth, which says to me that somebody was thinking a little bit ahead and said, we don't want to see UN troops captured here. We don't want the UN to be obviously involved in this thing, so that the American people realize it's really a whole UN operation. So Michael New said no. Michael New got canned. Michael New, in fact, was the only member of his unit that was obeying the law. The Army regulations forbid putting on extra accoutrements, they call them, on uniforms, and he was the only one who obeyed the Army regulations. There's never been any congressional authorization to put UN patches on any American military outfit. So those three men were exactly where Michael New was scheduled to be, and he said no, and I wish there were a lot more in the military that would say no. Of course, when they sacked him, a lot of people in the military said to themselves, well, can't get away with that. I have to stay, I have to do this, I have to follow orders, and so forth. Thank you very much.